Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the second session in the Spring 2020 Sunoikisis Digital Classics programme. There's a very slight change to the structure of this session. We'll be talking about the use of Wikipedia and other Wikimedia sites in research. Unfortunately, due to circumstances beyond his control, the Dimitrov, who was going to speak, is not able to join us. But we are joined by Emma Bridges, who was going to talk anyway, who's based here at the ICS in London, by Pietro Luzzo, who is a researcher in digital humanities and digital classics and digital African studies at the University of Hamburg, and Richard Novell, who works for Wikimedia UK. Pietro and Richard have joined us literally based on our appealing for help half an hour ago. So thank you extremely much to them, both of them. So the structure of the session shouldn't change too much. We'll try to stick with that as much as possible, which means that we'll start off with a presentation by Emma on the issues of using Wikipedia in research. We'll then talk a little bit about the Wikimedia ecosystem, a bit about editing Wikipedia, and then we'll have a couple of case studies at the end on particular projects that have used or are using Wikipedia and Wikimedia sites in various different ways. So I'll start off. I'll just hand over to Emma.
Thanks, Gabby. So just to confirm, can you see my screen?
Can now, yeah.
Yep, is that working? Great stuff.
Yes.
Okay, so this is going to be a very basic introduction to using Wikipedia for research. My slides are quite text heavy. I apologise for that, mainly because I thought I'm going to be talking mostly, but you can use those as a kind of aid-memoir afterwards if you want to go back and refresh your memory. Gabby will put those up on the Sunoikisis page afterwards. So I'm going to start with a very brief overview of some of the things to look out for when you're using Wikipedia for research, and then a few reflections on ways in which I found it to be useful for my own work. Now, inevitably, that bit's going to be quite personal for me. What you use it for is probably going to depend on your own specialism and your own particular research interests. And then I'll end this part of the presentation by talking a little bit about ways in which, as researchers, we can also all do our own bit to improve Wikipedia. So a few starting points about the potential of Wikipedia for researchers and some possible pitfalls. As we all know, anyone can edit Wikipedia. So it really does have the potential to be crowdsourcing at its absolute best, gathering knowledge and sharing that in a really powerful way, by kind of gathering lots of people's knowledge all together and sharing that more widely. But of course, that open accessibility does mean that it can be open to abuse. That said, Wikipedia is really heavily invested in ensuring transparency and reliability, and the community of editors, a huge community of editors worldwide on the whole, acts to sort of check one another's work and to step in when particular issues arise. It's also worth pointing out, I think, as well, that although anyone can edit, not everyone does. And the population of editors is very heavily skewed in terms of gender, ethnicity, geographical location, and so on. So there are some important issues to think about around how things are represented, what gets written about. One example of that, which I'm particularly familiar with, is in relation to gender bias, and that's something we'll come back to later in the session when we talk about one of the case studies, the Women's Classical Committee editing project. But the community does operate as a kind of universal peer review. So any editors can comment on and ask questions about each other's articles. Now, that's generally a really good thing, but of course that process is still only as good as or as neutral as the editors who happen to be looking at and commenting on a particular page. So it's worth being aware of that. And there's always a danger that some of the kind of inherent biases can just be replicated over and over again. Brilliantly as well, Wikipedia has the potential to be completely up to the minute, up to date for any article. Now, of course, the flip side of that is that it also only takes a few seconds for someone to vandalize a page or deliberately insert misleading information. So they're things to look out for. Again, all that said, it is completely transparent. So you can, at any point, you can see the full edit history of a page. You can see who's been making revisions. You can also, there are ways of reverting to earlier versions of a page if a page has been vandalized. And that's something we can talk about a little bit more in the open discussion when we come back to talking about experiences of editing Wikipedia and things to look out for. So a couple of things to look out for if you are using Wikipedia for your research. Again, I know that some of you will be more familiar with this than others, so apologies if some of this is quite basic, but I think it's worth kind of mentioning anyhow. One of the things to look out for is have a look at the page here, which I've linked on the slide, and again, which you'll have access to after the session. Look at how Wikipedia defines a good article, and that's a really good guide for the kinds of things you should be looking for to identify whether an article is going to be reliable or not. I'm just going to show you an example of one of those good articles, actually, if we can find it. So this article, if you look at the top page, you'll see it's been labelled as it's met all of the good article criteria. And actually, if we just take a brief glance at the page, even just looking at
could you zoom in a little bit, just on that page?
Sorry, hang on.
Just a little bit, thank you.
Hang on. Yeah. Is that okay?
Perfect, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so if we just even have a look at the structure of the page before we even read anything that it says, you get a sense of how nice and clear, how well structured this is. It's set out in lovely, neat paragraphs. It's got great headings. It's got a nice list of publications and references at the bottom. It's got an image and a really nice kind of ready reference info box here with some key facts about its subject. So they're all the kinds of things that actually automatically, when you look at a page, you get a feel for what makes it a good page. And the good article criteria cover things like, is it clear and concise? Is it written in such a way that a broad audience can understand it? Because bear in mind that, particularly if you're editing for Wikipedia, that you're writing for a non-specialist audience, so it needs to be really clear, concise prose. Is it verifiable? One of the really important rules of editing on Wikipedia is that it's not a place for original research. So all pages need good references and citations. When you look at the list of references, for this one in particular, you'll notice that they're from lots of different sources. They're not all just referencing one single source and extracting information from that. There's a good range of different kinds of sources. And you'll see there are references to things like scholarly journals. There are, in this case, published obituaries, online articles, things that are verifiable that you can say, right, okay, I can follow that reference up in the same way that you would if you were reading an academic article in a journal or something. You've got kind of all the sources here to have a look at. Another thing to look out for is, is it on topic? Sounds really obvious, but you will find that some Wikipedia articles tend to ramble, go off topic, stray away from what they're talking about. Actually, being concise and to the point is really, really helpful. Neutrality and lack of editorial bias is also really important. And again, I think this is something that we'll probably come back to a little bit later in the discussion. That, and this is linked, of course, also with referencing that it's not about kind of sort of presenting a one-sided view of the subject, but actually making sure it's neutral and without editorial bias. There's also something in the good article criteria about pages being stable, and what that means is that they're not subject to edit wars. If you look, one of the great things that we're talking about in terms of transparency and being able to look at the history is looking at the history of an article. If you click on View History at the top here, you can see every time someone's made a change to the page. You can even look at two versions and compare, so you can see what revisions people have made to a page over time. You see this one actually hasn't had a huge amount of input by lots and lots of different people. It's not been the subject of loads of edit wars. I think, Richard, you might have been involved in editing this one at one point. Yes, you have. So it's completely transparent. So if you're not sure who's added something or what's been added, then that's a good way of sort of finding out. Another nice thing about this particular article is that it's got an image, which again is another flag for a good article as well. So hold on one second. Go back to my PowerPoint. So just a few things to look at there. As well as viewing a page's history, you can also look at the talk pages. Actually, that's probably worth going back and having another look at that. So up here, and this is where editors discuss various elements, aspects of the page. In this case, there was a discussion about what it needed to make it meet the good article category. People question each other's edits. They're quite fascinating. I find the talk pages sometimes, where people explain why they've edited in a particular way or raise queries about things to do with the page. So again, this is all part of the transparency of Wikipedia. Another thing to look out for is whether a page has got any flags. So this is one that I just came across when I was looking at pages recently. A list of oracular statements from Delphi, very specific. And you'll see that this has got this text box at the top saying it needs additional citations for verification and with some suggestions as to how it can be improved. And there are various kinds of flags like this. You might find things that say this is actually this is not neutral, for example. There are certain statements that need removing. But again, the thing about having citations is really important. And actually, if we just scroll down this particular page, you will see there aren't a lot of little citation numbers. It just doesn't look as kind of clear and as well set out as that last page that we were just looking at. So again, kind of keep an eye on what's being said by the editing community about particular pages. So just a few things to look out for. So a couple of things that we can talk about in terms of what we might use Wikipedia for as researchers. As I said, this is very personal to you and what your kind of area is, and it'll vary from one person to another. I research classical reception quite a lot, so sometimes I find it really, really helpful as a way of getting background information on a new topic. I tend to find that I often have to venture into historical periods or into genres of texts, or to look at authors or films or artworks that I'm just completely unfamiliar with because they're outside the classical period that I know more about. So often I find it's a brilliant way of getting a brief contextual overview of something of a historical period, an author or a topic. And if I'm starting on a new piece of research, whether that's on a period that I'm already familiar with or on something entirely new, I often find that things like summaries of texts or historical events can be really helpful just for a bit of grounding and a bit of context. Although I have to say that sometimes I do find that pages on specific classical texts aren't always particularly concise and they can be quite confusing. So again, that's something to look out for, and maybe something to bear in mind if you get involved in editing, that you might want to think about addressing on some of the pages that you read. I also find it's a great starting point sometimes for finding bibliography, especially if it's a topic outside your usual area. For classics, I generally know which databases or libraries to search for material, but sometimes Wikipedia can be a really good supplement for those. But again, a caveat there, don't make the mistake of assuming that it's necessarily going to be exhaustive where bibliography and references are concerned. And I would also say I'd be quite wary if, for example, all of the bibliography listed on a particular page is quite dated. So if there's nothing from the last decade or two, I would start thinking, well, there must be stuff here that just hasn't been listed yet because the person that's written the page maybe doesn't know about it, or no one's come along yet and added that information yet. Another thing that I really, really like it for, again, more on the classical reception side, is that it's a brilliant place for finding things like receptions of particular lists of particular texts or themes. So I'm going to show you the page on the Oresteia, which I've been looking at recently. So this is a pretty hefty, hugely long page, but the bit I particularly like about it is the bit here on adaptations and translations. There are lots of things listed here. Again, this is where crowdsourcing is really, really valuable, because I could never have just come up with these with just kind of a Google search or by just kind of browsing in the library or looking at kind of classical dictionaries or whatever. Huge long list of translations. It's pretty English language heavy. In fact, almost entirely English language heavy when it comes to translations, and that's something that we can think about addressing for editing. If you have expertise in a different language, there's a quite a heavy kind of English language bias in a lot of cases. But you find things that you weren't expecting sometimes. This also, someone's taken the initiative and kind of created an entire page on the Oresteia in the arts and popular culture, which has got a brilliant and evolving list of all sorts of different receptions. So again, I think that's quite a fun place to start if you're researching reception. I find as well, whatever you're researching, that chasing up wiki links in articles, so these are the blue links that link out to other wiki pages, can lead to finding some unexpected gems that you might never have encountered before. So for example, here, if I click on the page for Tony Harrison, oh look, we've got another flag here. This is because it's a biography of a living person, so it needs more citations to verify, and there are certain rules of when you're writing about living people as well. But by following up those wiki links, just to come back to what I was saying earlier, we can find ourselves, kind of finding out about all sorts of things that we hadn't necessarily thought we needed to know about, but that can lead us down all sorts of interesting research rabbit holes. So again, that's just a few sort of ideas about the way I use it. I'd really like to hear about how other people use it in their own research if they work in different areas of classics particularly. So finally, just a few things that I would like to draw your attention to, that if you are a researcher, I think we've all got a bit of a responsibility, if we're interested in Wikipedia and if we use it, to make Wikipedia better by drawing on our own expertise and adding to Wikipedia where we can. I tend to find that sometimes when I say to people that I edit Wikipedia, they respond by complaining to me about a page that is related to something they know about that they think is inadequate. And my response to that is usually, well, anyone can edit. So if you're an expert on a thing, then you're very welcome to go and improve that page. And actually, I think we should all have a responsibility to do that if we can. There's a few things that are worth thinking about. How am I doing for time, Gabby? Am I okay to carry on a little longer?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so a few things to think about here. I think it's worth remembering that if ever you kind of carry out a Google search, how often is Wikipedia the first item, and a Wikipedia article the first item that comes up? Now, if you're a researcher, you might scroll down a few pages into the Google search results and so on, but actually think about how many people only ever look at the Wikipedia page because they're kind of just got a passing interest in something, and then think about how powerful it is to be able to share your specialist knowledge, how important it is to share your specialist knowledge with the wider world by making Wikipedia better so that people get more reliable information. So I think it's really, really important that we all try and do what we can to draw on our specialist knowledge in that way. But do remember, this is not a platform for sharing your original research. It's really, really important to remember that. And as I said earlier, everything needs to be supported with references which cite reliable published sources. There shouldn't be an article on something if there isn't a reliable source that can be cited. Contributions can be as big or as small as you have time for. So you might have time to write lots of new articles or rewrite existing ones that are inadequate for some reason. But even if you don't have time to do that, actually just a couple of minutes here and there are some really quick things that you can do to help improve a page which really help. And that might be things like adding bibliography or citations. I tend to find that if I'm researching a new text or topic and I'm putting myself a kind of reading list of references together, I'll go and look at the Wikipedia pages and I'll add in the things that I've found that aren't already being cited on that page. Again, just kind of improving the references there. Another thing you can do is you can add wiki links to other pages. So if you're reading a page, you can edit and link it up to other parts of Wikipedia so people can follow leads in the way that I was showing you on the Oresteia page. Adding categories as well is quite useful. And then another one that I think people sometimes forget about is uploading photographs, particularly say if you're somebody who goes to a lot of heritage sites or museums and you've taken photographs that you're happy to make open access, then that's a really good way of improving Wikipedia, giving permission for your images to be used there. So just basically a few kind of suggestions as to things that we need to look out for, things that we can do as researchers. I'm happy to kind of discuss this a bit further later on in the session, but I'm going to hand back to Gabby for now. Thanks, Gabby.
Thanks, Emma. That's great. Yeah, because we are going to talk a little bit more about issues when you are editing Wikipedia to look out for in a few minutes. So actually, we might come back to that slide at some point if we do that.
Yeah.
I think now, though, we'll hand over to Richard, if that's okay, who's going to give us a basically extemporized quick introduction to the Wikimedia ecosystem and what the various parts of that alongside and behind Wikipedia are.
Okay. Yeah. So build on what Emma said. Wikipedia is, I think it's worth thinking about the scale of it. So in English, there are 6 million entries, but it's also got more than 300 different language editions out there. And altogether, there are something like 50 million articles across those languages. So it's really an enormous resource of information. And importantly, it's openly licensed as well. So people can use it pretty much however they want. And it's very widely used. So it gets around 20 billion page views every month, which shows just how important it is to the public when it comes to getting information. So it's not just that it appears at the top of search engine results. Search engines also use information in Wikipedia to provide snippets. So providing little summary boxes at the side, or if you're asking say, Google personal assistant, it's very often going to be drawing information from Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia started in 2001, and very quickly it began to grow beyond just being a text encyclopedia. So at one point, a sister website was set up to host media files. So images, video clips, audio files, because they were getting used in more than just one place. And sometimes you would find that a Wikipedia article only has so much space for photographs, but it might be useful to have, say, 150 different images of a single historic site. So you want those to be housed somewhere else. And that's the purpose of Wikimedia Commons. It's that media library which is free to use. And it has about 40 million files and comprises most of the media used throughout Wikipedia and its sister sites. You've got some other websites as well, which are part of this network, all interconnected. So you have Wiki Quotes, which collects, as you might have guessed, quotes, usually from well-known figures, sometimes structured around particular topics or subjects. So if you looked up, I don't know if that was true, but if you look up, say, the topic of castle on Wiktionary, there's a good chance you would find the quote that an Englishman's home is his castle. And if that isn't the case, I will shortly change it after this session, because like Wikipedia, it's open to editing and anyone can take part in it, in this crowdsourcing process. You also have Wiki News, which is a citizen journalism website. It takes a crowdsourcing approach to creating news pieces, kind of in the way that Wikipedia does it and deals with breaking news, but on a different platform, and also has a platform for other types of journalism, not just repeating what's in reliable sources, but going out, doing interviews and reporting on particular events in an original fashion, which wouldn't fit with Wikipedia's ethos of everything has to be published somewhere else first in a reliable source before it appears in Wikipedia. So a few other places as well, such as Wiktionary, your open source dictionary, but perhaps the most interesting right now is Wikidata. So that's an open source database. Technically speaking, I think the term is knowledge graph. But essentially think of it as a really huge database, essentially for pretty much everything you can think of. So it started off as a database of things in Wikipedia, and what's on Wikidata can feed through to the other Wikipedia sites. So changes there can influence content in the rest of the Wikipedia ecosystem. Just like how Wikimedia Commons and image shared there is much easier to add to other Wikipedia sites, data on Wikidata is much easier to share throughout the sister websites. So for example, when the 2021 UK census takes place, rather than updating the population of Manchester in 150 or 200 languages, or however many languages that page is available in, you could do that just in one central place in Wikidata, and the change cascades through. So that's quite a straightforward use of Wikidata, but because it's open source and open to the crowd, it's kind of open-ended what it contains, and so it's expanded and expanded and expanded. So on the one hand, it gives us some very useful information about what's in Wikipedia in a way which was difficult to really query before. So we know how many biographies of people there are. We also know the various occupations these people had. We can see some trends in the popularity of the occupations through time, if we have, say, birth dates for these people. And then you can pull in information from elsewhere. So, for example, identifiers from the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, or bibliographic databases such as VIAF. And so you're pulling in other sources of information. And this is generally done in a semi-automated way. So the editors will select a data set they want to import and then go about putting that information into Wikidata. Now, for it to be useful, you want to find areas of overlap with already existing content on Wikidata. At that point, there's some fuzzy matching based on names and perhaps other identifiers in the databases to see where things match up. And there's also a lot of human work in there as well to see, to work out if, say, John Smith is in one database is the same John Smith in another, or if you need to have separate entities. And so there's an awful lot of activity going on with Wikidata. One way in which it influences Wikipedia, which you might not realize, is that down the left-hand side of Wikipedia articles, you find links to the same article in other languages. That initially used to be done by hand until Wikidata came along and then centralized it. And so in the past, if you created a new article in, say, Spanish, and it had articles or on the same topic in French, German, Dutch, and English, you would need to go to each of those articles and manually create a link. However, with Wikidata, because it's centralized, you just need to do that once in Wikidata. However, it's actually a bit more streamlined than that. If you want to be really proactive, you can go into Wikidata, edit a pre-existing entry or create one if it's a completely new topic, and then create that link yourself. But if you don't do that, that's fine, because there are automated processes which are run by the editors to pick up on pages which don't have Wikidata entries yet. So it does create this pipeline of getting stuff from Wikipedia into Wikidata. And when Wikidata was set up, a lot of information was drawn from Wikipedia. So Wikidata is really intended to be a machine-readable database, which means that rather than having sentences, it has very brief statements. So it will say that John Smith, it will have a column for date of birth and then give you the figure for that. And it does it in a very easy way for machines to understand. And as a result, that's used by companies like Google to power their search results. That's not always as obvious as, say, Wikipedia, because it's not really appearing at the top. You don't very often get a link to Wikidata as a result, because it's not really there for the average reader. But it does help structure the information they're presenting to people in a way which kind of happens in the shadows and you're not necessarily aware of unless you've come across Wikidata before. And so Wikipedia actually contains quite a bit of machine-readable information itself, and that was then transposed into Wikidata. So when Emma was showing us an example of a good article on Wikipedia, she mentioned that little box on the right-hand side containing a summary of some key facts about that person's life, their date of birth, date of death, place of birth, profession, and so on. And because it's nicely structured in that box, it was then very easy to create a little program which took that information and put it into Wikidata, which creates an interesting issue, since on Wikipedia, that information would have to have a source. And on Wikidata, that source becomes Wikipedia, unless you're manually going in and updating the reference to be something else. So it creates an interesting juxtaposition, because Wikipedia wouldn't allow Wikipedia as a source in its own articles. But for the sake of generating Wikidata and seeing what's created out of it, that was the initial step, taking the content from Wikipedia. Now, since then, there's been a lot of efforts to add references, ensure that where this information is coming from is transparent, since if you go to the Wikipedia article the information was taken from, it might have been changed in the meantime. And also picking particular data sets and importing them and giving a reference back to that data set. So stuff like the Pleiades Gazetteer of Historic Sites. Wikidata has some identifiers attached to various entries about historic sites in there. So you can link that Wikidata item to the Pleiades entry. And stuff as well like the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. So you can find out how many people in that dictionary have Wikipedia entries. You can look it up and say how many have it in English, how many in German, how many in French, if you know how to use the querying service, which again is an open tool for anyone to use and explore the content of Wikidata. And there are organizations as well, such as museums and libraries, who are looking at mapping their content onto Wikidata. So National Library of Wales has put, they've been sharing some of their collections. They've been putting images on Wikimedia Commons and creating entries on Wikidata about these images. So making sure there's a linked open data which can be used throughout the web, but also is then easily queryable by the public if they want to understand what their collection contains. And it also has the benefit of potentially connecting different museum collections. So content about the National Library of Wales can speak to content about, say, Bodleian libraries. And you can see where their collections intersect. And so it gives you a way of examining what's out there through what's called linked open data. And Wikidata, because it's so open-ended, has a lot of bibliographic data as well. So it's being used by something called the Initiative for Open Citations, which basically is a partnership involving a lot of data holders, including Crossref, I think Taylor and Francis, Web of Science, and putting information about scientific publications into Wikidata. The idea being that it would be easier to then cite them on Wikipedia, but also it creates some interesting byproducts. So there are some people using this information to create research profiles for authors, for institutions, for publishers, for academic journals, and using it to create a flexible bibliography about particular subjects. So an early use for this was to create a reading list for publications about Zika virus, when there was a lot of work happening on that a few years ago. And you could see in the various visualizations they had the sharp uptake in the scholarship around this. You can see who was working with who, what works were being cited most often, what journals were publishing this kind of content. And so providing some interesting ways to understand the publishing world and how knowledge was formed and shared in that area. And that can be quite handy as well when it comes to writing Wikipedia articles, because it's showing potential stuff you can add in when you're writing that. So who particular people collaborate with, what their most important works are based on I've got this as a rough measure, but say citation count, and stuff like that. So because it is such a large project, it can be a bit of everything, and really is very powerful and quite exciting with the potential behind it, because it is being picked up by search engines and other places. It has just as much potential as Wikipedia does. And it links through to all the other parts of Wikimedia as well. So there's currently an initiative with Wikimedia Commons to bring in some of that structured data to make searching the content a lot easier. Because when it started, it was using a wiki to store images, which wasn't producing the best search results. But the idea being that by bringing in structured data, it's much easier to find the kind of stuff you're after. So it all links together within the world of Wikimedia and has a very positive impact beyond that as well. So that's my potted introduction to the Wikimedia ecosystem.
Great, thank you, Richard. That's really that's perfect. I think that gives a very good overview of what how these various systems work, and particularly the thing that interested me, how Wikidata ties it all together and in which direction the data moves. I think that's actually answered a question that I didn't know the answer to. Well, several questions I didn't know the answer to there. So thank you. Does anyone want to comment a little bit on that, or ask any further questions about any of that, or give further examples? Everybody's invited to unmute and join in now. Likewise, anyone who's watching this live, there's a little live comment box in the top right-hand corner of your YouTube window. Please feel free to leave questions and comments there.
Well, if I may, I think as a user of Wikimedia related projects, especially Wikidata and the Wikipedia pages, not just in the huge English Wikipedia, but in the Italian or the German Wikipedia, one of the things I like more is in the history, the possibility of saying thank you to the other editor. That I think is a factor of change in comparison to many other collaborative projects around there, because it ties into the community very much. I like that a lot. And
I always wondered exactly what was going on with that feature. I only discovered it when Richard thanked me for something. Once. I think I've been thanked on Wikipedia 3 times, all times by Richard, to do with entirely based on the fact that we have very heavily overlapping interests in classics and archaeology, I imagine. But so I kind of wondered what that was doing. Would you like to expand, Pietro, on why you think that's a valuable thing, and maybe anyone else add to that?
I think it's a valuable feature in comparison to the grid for citability of resources from the researcher community. Most people would not edit Wikipedia because they'd publish their original research and expect that somebody else cites their articles. Whereas the fixing of a mistake into a Wikipedia page would not be worth the time because nobody's going to cite that. Yeah. Whereas I think that thank you on a small edit is a rather worthwhile achievement, even for an academic career, is not counting much. So I think it's a game-changing feature.
Okay.
I think it also helps to make taking part in Wikipedia and the Wikimedia projects a bit nicer, because you're getting that positive feedback, which it might not take you long to fix it, but it shows that other people are recognizing your work and appreciating it, because you don't actually get much feedback from the readers. So it's pretty much entirely from other editors and your peers. And someone might give you, say, a barn star or talk page message, but that's usually for something a bit more of an effort that it will recognize. Whereas the thank function, it can recognize just about everything. And it's kind of like giving a like on Facebook or on Twitter. It helps you understand that people see the work you're doing and do appreciate it.
I certainly see the value in just a gentle, positive, emotional, just someone being nice, given that, probably 5 times as often as I've been thanked for an edit, I've had an edit inexplicably reverted. That's a mild, horrible thing. So, mild, nice things happen, to counterbalance that is valuable, yeah.
Absolutely.
It can turn out to be quite time-consuming to follow up on discussions on reverts or whether an entry is worth or not. But I think it's always enriching to find out what other people think about. I went out there with the very nice intent of sharing a picture, and I upload it on Wikimedia Commons, and 2 days after I get notified that, well, I actually shouldn't have done that. Regardless how nice I thought that would be. And then one learns about a range of things which are indeed very interesting in their own, beside the contribution.
Yeah. So, this I think is probably morphing naturally into the conversation about things to bear in mind when you're editing Wikipedia or any of the other sites. Emma, at the end of her presentation, talked a bit about some of the the guidelines from Wikipedia themselves. It might be worth sort of very briefly summarizing some of the other things to watch out for. Key rules, including notability. They don't want to see articles on just anything. If it hasn't been cited in some reliable media, then it probably isn't notable enough to have a page. There are some exceptions to that, but that's one sort of guideline. Neutral point of view. So as Emma said, you should be writing, giving the sort of state of the scholarship or the state of understanding on a topic, not one particular viewpoint, no matter how true you think that viewpoint is. Having sources cited, and another quite important one that is quite easy to fall foul of is conflict of interest. It's sometimes expressed as don't edit the Wikipedia page on yourself, but it's a bit wider than that. Most of us don't have our own Wikipedia pages, but it's a bit broader than that, in that if you are the expert on a topic, or you are heavily invested in a topic, you may not be the right person to edit that page. Anything anyone wants to add to any of those or clarify about any of those?
Just on the conflict of interest thing, people are often tempted to write papers for their PhD supervisors or people who teach them or colleagues. Now, colleagues, it's quite a works in quite a broad sense. Within one subject area, it can be quite a small world. But I would say probably don't edit the pages of someone in whose department you are based, even maybe. You just, I think it's really important to just bear that kind of thing in mind. And yeah, definitely don't be writing pages for your PhD supervisors on that one.
On the other hand, I mean, I would sort of push back a little bit. I push back against every single one of Wikipedia's guidelines, partly because they are guidelines, not laws, right? Which is that, I mean, at what point does your relationship to your PhD supervisor, your former PhD supervisor, cease to be, I mean, I have edited, in fact, I may even have created, or if not, I certainly contributed very heavily to the page for my former PhD supervisor, who, I finished my PhD many years ago. My PhD supervisor has been dead for quite a few of those years. So do I have a conflict of interest? Maybe. I mean, I think she's incredibly reputable, and I would like her to get credit for that. But does that mean that I really shouldn't be allowed to add a couple more publications to that page than are already there? Of course not. I think even, I mean, should I be allowed to edit your Wikipedia page? Well, stop me.
I think that's where Wikipedia's crowdsourcing element comes into its own, really. So conflicts of interest, whether it's on Wikipedia or in other parts of the professional world, are things which can be managed. Often it has to be very carefully done. And on Wikipedia, editing about, say, your supervisor or an area in which you're a leading authority, it's not a blanket no, but it certainly isn't a beginner task, because you have to kind of negotiate these situations. What you really want to do is get familiar with how Wikipedia works first. Get your feet under the table by writing some articles, getting a feel for how Wikipedia views neutrality, and so on. And then I do understand the temptation to write about, say, your supervisor, because if their page doesn't exist yet, at some point you'd say, well, I might try it myself. At which point it's worth thinking about, with that experience hopefully behind you, how the Wikimedia community would view that kind of editing. At which point, if I was trying to do that, I would come up with a bare bones draft and then post that in the draft area of Wikipedia and ask for feedback from other Wikipedia editors. So it's not just me writing it. It's making sure the community is involved in the review process. They get a very early opportunity to say, hang on, the tone here isn't quite right, or actually there appears to be big chunks missing. Why is that? And so really establishing that dialogue very early on. And similarly, if it's not just writing about that, say, an area in which you are a leading researcher, there's certainly a temptation to get your research out there the minute it goes up, the minute the article is published in a journal. There's temptation to put a link to it on Wikipedia. I would say, rather than doing that, I certainly do understand why you'd want to do that, suggest it using the talk page. Say that there's this new publication which might be relevant here. Do other Wikipedia editors feel it'd be worth including? And making clear your link to the subject and the publication as well. So that it's not just you writing about your topic, it's other Wikipedia editors coming in and taking part. Because as a member of the public, if you come along and find a Wikipedia page written by primarily one person, it may be a very good page. But the more people take part, the more, as a general rule, the better quality it is, and the more confident you are, because there's been this discourse working out what should go in the page, what the focus should be, and who's represented amongst citations as well.
Yeah, I certainly take that point. I mean, one of the things that I think the way I would see conflict of interest as being a useful flag is if there is a problem with the page, if the person who wrote it has a very close link to the topic of the page, that may be an extra flag to look at it. Or, you know, it may be an excuse that people would use to delete the page or to revert your edits or whatever. If there isn't a problem with the page, you know, if, for example, you create 20 new pages as part, you know, for classics professors as part of a large project, and one of the, you know, so you've got experience, you know what these pages look like, they're all good quality pages, and one of them happens to be someone you have a fairly close link to, that'll probably be much like the others and probably won't be a problem with that page. And, you know, in that case, no one's going to flag it and say, wait a minute, you know that person, delete. But by the same, I totally take your point that it's, a lot of these guidelines are especially useful for beginners to keep in mind, because it's be that much harder to get that balance right and to make sure that quality is there. Yeah.
And a very quick point is that some of these guidelines, like conflicts of interest and dealing with spam, were developed not with researchers in mind, but with, say, PR companies or people trying to push a record label, that kind of thing.
Yes, yes.
And so the community deal much more with that than researchers. So that's also part of the reason why it's good to stick with that as well, because by and large, though experts are very welcome on Wikipedia, it's much more likely that editors will come into contact with people trying to push an agenda. And so, yeah, that's a kind of mindset very often.
And that can be something that leads to conflict and to disagreements that may be a little bit hard to understand if you're a researcher. It's like, well, you know, yes, I've written a book on Aeschylus, but I just want this page on Aeschylus to be really good. How is that a conflict of interest? You know, he wasn't my PhD supervisor. But no, go ahead, Pietro.
Also, for small research communities like Ethiopian Studies, where I'm now, if we were to exclude people we know everyone, nobody would write a page on Ethiopian scholars or add a publication. So.
Right, absolutely. Is it worth taking a couple of minutes to talk about what sorts of disagreements and conflicts you might expect especially if you're writing on a more popular or even a more controversial topic in Wikipedia, and some of the ways in which we might try to deal with that, and some of them are, you know, I'm not sure how one does deal with that. So, you know, sorts of things that can happen is you edit a page or create a page, another editor comes along and immediately proposes your page for deletion. It's not notable enough, or they spot that you have a conflict of interest, or they look at it and say, well, this is a stub page, it doesn't have enough citations yet, remove it, you know, delete it rapidly. You say, well, there are hundreds of pages that don't have enough citations yet. The idea is that they will gradually get better. Why is my one being singled out for deletion? Because it was only edited today. You know, these sorts of issues that come up. Do people have thoughts on how you deal with these sorts of these issues when they do arise? I mean, one thing is to avoid them by making sure the page is as good as possible before you make it public. But if the issue arises anyway.
I think.
Sorry, go right ahead.
So, I think one of the things that's been really useful in the project that I'm involved in, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment, and that Richard's had some involvement as well, is having that community around you and building relationships with other editors, so that you do have a community that can come and kind of have a look at what's being going on a page and kind of mediate if necessary, because sometimes people get very entrenched in particular views, and you see that if things flare up. One of the issues that we have a lot in our project is that we edit pages of women scholars, and the notability criteria is often a bit of a problem. It should be automatic. If someone's a professor, then they should meet the notability criteria, but inevitably it's often quite difficult to find reliable sources on women scholars because they don't get written about as much, and then we get into this kind of vicious circle. So that often is a thing where it's really soul destroying if you've crafted a lovely page and then someone comes along and says, well, actually this person isn't notable. So actually having a community who understands what you're doing and those issues can be really, really helpful. And we've certainly had a lot of support from Wikipedia editors in the community more widely as well. But that does take time to build up.
Yeah, so these, as you say, these cases do crop up. Discussion really is the key, and bring your sources. It's better to have too many and not need them than too few, really. And as academics and researchers, we're kind of in a really good position when it comes to writing Wikipedia topics. Our bread and butter is using references. Where it might get tricky is if we are, say, using primary sources to back up a person's notability or to include content in a Wikipedia article about a subject. Because Wikipedia, it only allows very select use of primary sources. The reason kind of underlying that is that Wikipedia editors generally aren't experts. So we look to the secondary sources to assess the weight to put behind these primary sources. So you might find snippets of, say, manuscripts or ancient authors quoted in Wikipedia articles, but by and large, the content should come from those secondary sources. But as researchers, we're also primed to use those primary sources, whether it's excavation reports, lab analyses, or say even a library catalogue to verify a person's holdings. That kind of stuff can be perhaps a bit borderline, and you kind of it depends on who you run into on Wikipedia and how that conversation goes. You might be finding someone who's familiar with academic publishing and understands that, say, a PhD thesis is a perfectly fine source to use, or you might find someone who's undergraduate educated but hasn't engaged with that kind of material before and doesn't understand why you wouldn't use a book instead. And then, of course, there are cultural differences as well. So I agree with Emma's statement that professors is a pretty reasonable bar to have de facto notability set in. But in the US, any university teacher is called a professor. So you run into this issue around nomenclature and different roles, and you kind of have to bridge that divide and understand that this is a general public you're interacting with, not just amongst the readers, but with the editors as well. And so you're having to explain kind of how things work sometimes, and how, well, yes, this person is a professor, which, as you can see from their job description, is means that they've got decades of research behind them and have a high research profile and are noted in their field. And while it's not necessarily perfect, it does give you a reasonable measure. And so you have those kind of conversations coming up. And with that, I think the underlying point is perhaps to be patient and, yeah, remember that having discussions is a good thing with that. And it's an opportunity to help that editor understand the situation so that in the future, if they engage in that area again, they'll be better primed to understand and not create issues again.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to remember that an editor rejecting your work is part of a conversation. It's the beginning of a conversation, and you should engage with that. I want to remind us that that Wikipedia has a set of guidelines for how to have these conversations. Among them, they have guidelines such as civility. Be nice. Someone might revert your work and in an absolutely ridiculous way, and you're absolutely outraged by it. But you still should never, under any circumstances, call them a wanker for doing so. Right? I mean, that's absolutely shouldn't do that. You should also assume good faith. You can't. I mean, are they being deliberately obtuse? Come on, they must understand this. No, assume good faith and proceed in that. That's going to lead, 90% of the time, that's going to lead to much, much more fruitful conversations and much more positive outcomes on that. The one thing I do want to push back against that on a little bit is that the calls for civility and calls to assume good faith can be abused. If someone clearly, is being, passive aggressive and is clearly not acting in good faith, then requiring you to act in good faith to assume good faith and to be civil in response to them is, privileging the abusive person, privileging the bully. Like being neutral in all circumstances means you're always going to be on the side of the bully, right? That's a general, and that's no different here. I don't know what the solution to this is. It's just that sometimes I do know what the solution is. Walk away. If the Wikipedia article is not as good because Wikipedia's community is not able to deal with this case of this abuse, that's their loss. It's not worth your getting too upset about it. But that's not a perfect solution, obviously.
Yeah, and on that's a really good point. And Wikipedia itself hasn't come up with a good solution to that. Partly because Wikipedia isn't populated by dispute resolution experts. It's populated by nerds who want to share information online and put hours and hours of effort into this, and will become sometimes very invested in it. And so you've got that power dynamic as well. You get a lot of people who are really open-minded and are thrilled to see someone else editing an article, trying to improve it, understand that if an edit isn't quite right, that someone's still trying to improve. And it's whichever website you go to, whichever kind of community, there will be a minority of people who do not play nicely. And it's always an issue about how to deal with those people. Sadly, Wikimedia hasn't yet worked out how. Partly because of the nature of the community, and partly because I don't think I've really seen a good solution from anywhere online, really.
No, it's not just Wikipedia that doesn't have the solution. I don't think we do know what that solution is. I think that's absolutely fair. So shall we move on to? We're going to have two very quick case studies. I mean, Emma, you've already talked a little bit about the WCC stuff, a little bit. So maybe just sort of quickly expand on that, and I'll talk even more briefly about another case study after that.
Sure. Okay. So if I just bring the project page up on the screen, so hopefully everyone can see it. So this is the project for WCC Wiki, which is a collaborative project with a very specific aim, which is to increase the representation of women classicists on Wikipedia. It was initiated by a group of us from the Women's Classical Committee in the UK back in January 2017. Before the project began, Richard actually did a bit of a kind of calculation and established that there are about 200 biographies of classicists on English language Wikipedia, but only probably less than 10% had women as their subjects. Now, part of the Women's Classical Committee's mission is to advance equality and diversity in the field. And so one way of doing that is to increase the visibility of women classical scholars through projects like this. So we had support from Wikimedia trainers to set up our project, and we since then have held regular monthly editing sessions. We run events training other people to edit Wikipedia, but we have kind of remote editing sessions. Sometimes we do face-to-face, but most of the time, once a month, we meet online for a couple of hours and edit. And of course, we edit in between times as well if we have time, but it's quite nice to have that kind of focus once a month. So we've been involved in creating or improving around about, I think, 400 articles focusing on women classicists, and just to have an idea of them, I'm not going to kind of go through them all, but you can kind of see them listed by the dates we've improved them. So it's kind of snowballed, and I think it's a really good example of how the collective action of lots of people, sometimes in very small ways, can make a real difference. It's sort of become quite self-perpetuating, because every time we run a training event, we usually get one or two more people on board who sometimes then go on to run their own events, training more people, and so on, to edit, and the project sort of grows. We also work to make sure that the work of women scholars is cited. One of the issues with scholarship is that women's work doesn't tend to be cited as often as men's work. So we kind of make the effort to, you know, work out, right, okay, which women are being cited or who's not being cited, which pages need, you know, who are the leading scholars in their field, and why are they not being referenced on the pages relating to the work. We help to make the women become more visible by kind of cross-linking to other pages, by adding wiki links on relevant pages to their work and so on. So it's as I said, produced quite clear results in a relatively short space of time. Largely because individuals can basically spend as much or as little time. If you only have a few minutes, you can still do something that makes a difference as well. Do you want me, Gabby, to do a quick tour of the project page, or are we running out of time? Should we let people do that for themselves?
I think we're probably okay, unless there's anything in particular you wanted to point to.
Nothing in particular. I guess the only thing is if people are interested in doing some editing themselves, our project page, which I'm showing here, has a bunch of resources that can be useful. So we've got just some quick links to some of the basic introductory resources from Wikipedia. So actually, it's a good place to find a few things gathered together if you want to have go. I'm not saying you have to necessarily come and start editing pages of women classical scholars, but if you just want some guidance on where to start, then have a look at our resources as well. But of course, if you do want to get involved in the project, we very much welcome your participation. And as I say, we tweet using the hashtag WCCWiki, and you can find all the information about upcoming sessions and so on our project page.
Maybe just quickly show the list of red links or recently edited pages.
Yeah. Under the Aims tab here, we've got a bunch of pages we're editing, basically sort of organised by how much work needs doing. So we've got quite a lot of articles that that need bits and pieces adding. So some don't have images. That's quite a common issue, where we ask people to kind of, if they meet somebody who has a Wikipedia page, to ask if they can have permission to take a photo and upload it. But further down the page, all of these red links are people who don't yet have a page, but who we have identified, members of the project have identified as being notable and deserving of a page. So if you do want to kind of contribute and you want to write a page on someone, this is a good place to start. And you'll see these red links all over Wikipedia in all sorts of contexts, and anyone can create a new page for a red link. But as I say, we've got quite a long list that we're working through. So do feel free to participate if you'd like to.
Yeah, great, thanks. That's brilliant. I was going to talk very briefly about a Wikidata-based project that I worked on, which I think I have. If I can find my screen. Apologies if I occasionally share the wrong person's screen while we're talking. It's a very confusing interface when there's 4 people online simultaneously. So I just wanted to very briefly mention that as part of the Crosscultural Afterlife of Classical Sites CALCS project that I ran with Valeria Vitale a few years ago, almost 4 years ago, in fact, our aim was to add Arabic and Turkish, in particular Arabic and Ottoman names, to classical to the place records for classical sites in Pleiades, the Pleiades Gazetteer, on the basically based on the fact that over half of probably about half of the former Roman Empire is part of the world that later came under the Arab or Ottoman rule. But well over half has at one point or another been under Arab or Ottoman rule, if you include all of the Balkans and all of Spain and so forth. And a very large part of it are still Arabic speaking or Turkish speaking. And yet if you look in Pleiades, you won't find the Arabic name for a classical site in 95% of the time. So we wanted to try and remedy that to some degree. And the two approaches to that, one was actually to go through and by hand look at medieval manuscripts in Arabic and look at modern Arabic atlases and pull out Arabic names and Turkish names and so forth for some of these sites. And the other, at a slightly larger scale, was that I wrote some scripts, and these scripts, there are Python scripts in the repo for the Couts project here, that basically, whenever Pleiades had a site, such as this site Cyrene that is in Libya, the variant names for Cyrene in Libya given are Claudiopolis, Kyrene in Latin, and Cyrene in English. No Arabic name, no other names related to that. They do, however, cite a Wikipedia article on Cyrene down here in the references. If you go to the Wikipedia article for Cyrene, you will find the Wikidata page for Cyrene, which has many different language versions on here, one of which is Arabic, which says that, that is called Shahat, or rather the modern city, the modern Libyan city, which is closest to that archaeological site is Shahat, which is not quite the same thing as saying that Cyrene is called Shahat in Arabic. In fact, we also see that that Cyrene is also called Kurdina in Arabic, as a when it's referring to the ancient site rather than the modern site. But in any case, we could programmatically, using these scripts, pull out a few thousand examples of Arabic names for sites that are in Pleiades that didn't already have them. We generated this table with these entries in, and we're in the process of pulling that into Pleiades ever since. That obviously these have to be peer reviewed before they can just be automatically thrown in. The issue partly being that when we're talking about the linked open data ecosystem, if you assume that your script has correctly identified the Wikipedia page and the Wikidata entry, and the Wikidata has correctly transcribed the Arabic on there, and then you hard code that in, you may be perpetuating mistakes at one or other step of that process. So it all has to be hand checked on there. But this is one of the things that I think is really valuable about Wikidata, that, as Richard was describing, that it can be used as part of this linked open data ecosystem. So I'll stop there. I guess we've got to the point where we can briefly talk about, unless, as I say, anyone on YouTube has any questions, please do put them in the comment, the live chat box, and we'll keep an eye on that. We can talk briefly about the exercise that we want the students, we suggest for students and other participants of this. Emma, do you want to talk about that very briefly, or shall I?
Happy for you to, but I can chip in if you would like me to.
Okay, I'm just trying to find the Sunoikisis page so I can be showing it at the same time. But yeah, let me share my screen again then. At the bottom of this, we talked about the exercise. So just very briefly, let me zoom in to that a little bit. Is that readable now? Yeah. So the exercise is basically, we suggest that you, and for my students watching, this is more than a suggestion, this is a requirement, but anyone else in the world watching is welcome to do this as well. First create an account on Wikipedia if you don't already have one, and log in. A really important part of that, do not wait until you arrive in the classroom to create your Wikipedia account, because if 20 people create Wikipedia accounts from the same IP address at the same time, they will be flagged as bots, and we may end up not able to edit. So create the Wikipedia account from home well before we come to class. And ideally, we'd suggest that you create a new page. Look down the list of red links. We've got several links here on this page, including from the WCC Wiki project, as Emma just showed, but there are also Wikipedia lists of red links, and a red link is a link to a page, and it says a link is because someone thinks that page exists or thinks that page should exist, but it doesn't. And so there are lists of red links for archaeology, for literature, and for philosophy, as well as for lists of women classicists. And and go to one of these links and do enough research to create a basic page for that subject or that person. Feel free to not make that page public yet. If you create that page as in a sandbox, as it were, or the draft area, which maybe we might ask Richard to explain in a minute where that is. Then you can look at it with your fellow students before making it public. But ideally, we would fairly soon make that page public. If you're not ready to create a page from scratch yet, make a significant improvement to an existing page. Again, there's a category in Wikipedia called stub, and there are many stub categories. There's stubs for Greek mythology, Roman people, archaeology, classical studies, and you can also try, as Emma suggested, the recently created pages at WCC Wiki, and look at those pages and see how they can be improved by adding sources, adding citations, expanding the prose, adding sections. In particular, look at the talk pages. If you see someone says, I would really like to see a section on X here, and this is what we might put in it, and other people say, yes, I agree, but no one's actually done it yet, and you could volunteer to do so, and so forth. And so we want a page to which you have made a significant contribution, whether you've created it and are hoping that other people will expand it, or whether you've expanded one that's already been created. We'll talk about that a little bit in the short term, but also keep an eye on this page over the rest of the semester and see whether other Wikipedia editors come in. Some of you may find that someone comes along and deletes your page. That would be a shame and infuriating, and all the things that we've described, but is it already something interesting to talk about? Ideally, what will happen is someone will come along and improve your page, or they might make change to it which you don't feel improves it, and a conversation could be had about that. I think this is what I think is going to be the interesting part of the exercise. But the essential part is that starting now, you should be thinking about creating or significantly improving a Wikipedia page, and then we'll talk more about this in future weeks. So Richard, tell me if I'm correct, or rather correct me, because I'm almost certainly not correct. If I were creating a draft page that I didn't want to be live on Wikipedia yet, but I wanted other people to be able to look at, I would create it as a sub page of my homepage. Is that what you mean by a draft page?
That's certainly how I do it.
Okay.
As with many things on Wikipedia, there are a couple of ways of doing it. If you create an account, at the top, on the right-hand side, you will have a few extra links, which you don't have if you're not logged in. Next to your name will be a label reading Sandbox. If you click on that, that's basically your personal writing area. Other people can see it, so it's not as if it's a private document, but by convention, they won't edit it unless you invite them to. There is something else called Draft Space, which is a separate part of Wikipedia where you can draft articles if you don't want to use that sandbox for whatever reason. I don't think it's necessary for what we're trying to do. You can put your draft in your sandbox.
Okay, thanks.
And if you do want other people to take part, other students, you can email them a link to the sandbox and they can edit it as well.
So just quickly, there are the links up on the top of that page there that Richard was talking about.
Yeah,
I was trying to show that and I realized I wasn't logged in. So yes, you have your talk page, your sandbox, and the various other things that are connected to your thing there. So
can I just share a tip that I found really helpful when I started?
Oh shit. Yes, sorry.
A tip that I think was probably one of Richard's tips actually when I first started editing, which was that if you want to create a new page, find a good page on a similar sort of topic and copy the structure. You know, you can literally copy the code for it, but you can actually, it's a really helpful way of organizing a new article when you first start out. I still find that really useful if I'm creating a new page as well. So yeah, just.
Yeah, I certainly do that for copying the info box, because that uses a very specific code structure that I do not have internalized. Although I must have created dozens of info boxes, but there's no way I could do one from scratch. But yes, find a person about whom hundreds of things appear in their info box, and copy that, and you can delete 90% of them, because all you're going to say is where they were born and what their PhD subject was, or something like that. Yeah, I mean that's a fairly that's a variant on a fairly good rule for any digital work. Which is copy existing code, and I think we'll talk about that when we talk about Python in a couple of weeks. Python programmers very seldom write a Python script from scratch. They'll go out and copy one that does the same thing already, and then adapt it for what they need. So yeah, same applies. Anything else? Anything anyone wanted to add or ask? I thought I did have a question, but I've forgotten it now. No, I had a small question for Emma, and this may just be my misunderstanding, but I'm almost certain that I'm not correct here. But you said that before the WCC Wiki project started, there were about 200 biographies of classicists, about 15 or 20 of which were women, and you've now created 400 biographies of women. Does that mean that 2/3 of all classicists on Wikipedia are now women?
It doesn't work like that.
I suspected it didn't, but
I think what is kind of people are writing pages for men at probably a faster rate than we can write pages for women, despite all the efforts that we are making. So yeah, there's still a long way to go before you feel like you've reached a balance, but we certainly feel like we have made some headway compared to where we were. But yeah, Richard probably has more stats on that kind of thing to hand.
Oh, it's been absolutely transformative. Over the last year, I think there were 150 biographies of female classicists added to the English Wikipedia, and about 200 about men. So if I'm remembering the numbers correctly, it was about 40% of the biographies created that year about classicists were about women, which is incredible considering how unbalanced it was to begin with. And the fact that if it wasn't for the committee's work, it would probably still be that low, to be honest. When I was running those numbers initially, it was a bit embarrassing to have to admit that. I expected it to be fairly low, but not quite that bad.
So it might be that we now have about 1/3 of the biographies of classicists are women. If they've gone up, if they've improved that sort of.
It's about 1 in 5 at the moment,
and
because there's still a lot of biographies of men being written. But last year, it was really impressive to see the proportion created that year was much closer to even.
But that is really impressive. Yeah, I was sure that my interpretation of those numbers must be wrong. Cool. Okay, so we don't have anybody yet asking any questions on YouTube, so I guess we're more or less done here. Thank you to Pietro and Richard again for joining us at the last minute. Thanks to Emma for your part in this. And please join us next week for the session on, he quickly looks it up, on markup. We're giving an introduction to XML markup. This will be a session on Epidoc, which will be taught by myself and by Charlotte Tubman from Exeter. And we hope you'll all come along for that. Thanks again. See you soon.
Thanks, Gabby.
Thank you.